Good afternoon, and thanks so much for joining us for our In Conversation with the Attorney-General, the Honourable Shannon Fentiman, who's not just the Attorney-General, but Minister for Justice, Minister for Women, and Minister for the Prevention of Domestic and Family Violence. Can I begin by acknowledging that we're meeting you from Turrbal and Yagara land, and pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging. There's members joining us from all over Queensland today, so can I pay my deep respects to traditional owners from all of the lands that you're meeting us on, and also my respects to all First Nations people joining us online today. Also, really like to extend our thanks to the QT Centre for Justice, who have partnered with QCOSS today to bring this In Conversation event to you. I also want to tell you that I'm in the process of recovering from COVID. I no longer have COVID, but I'm really sorry if my breathing isn't what it usually is. Please bear with me if I have a coughing fit. I'm really delighted to be doing this In Conversation event today with the Attorney-General. By way of introduction, I think it's fair to say that she has been a wonderful supporter and is a wonderful supporter of the community services sector. The Attorney is a strong advocate for social justice, for standing up for working people's rights, and is particularly passionate about gender equality, non-discrimination, and making sure that our communities in Queensland are just and fair. Since joining Parliament in 2015, the Attorney has held quite a few portfolios, including communities, women, youth, child safety, multicultural affairs, employment and small business, training and development, and since November 2020 she has been the Attorney-General, Minister for Justice and Minister for the Prevention of Domestic and Family Violence. Prior to her commencing her parliamentary career, the Attorney was, of course, a lawyer, and she also was a board member of the Logan Women's Health and Wellbeing Centre, the Secretary of the Centre Against Sexual Violence in Logan, and also a duty solicitor at the Beenleigh Neighbourhood Centre. Today's discussion is going to really focus on the new Queensland Women's Strategy, which will run from 2020 to 2027. The Attorney recently launched the strategy. It was developed in really close consultation with QCOSS and many of our members. During the consultation, our members and many other stakeholders made it clear that a focus on economic security would be welcome. Obviously, economic security is essential if we're going to achieve safety and wellbeing for women. It has been recognised as absolutely fundamental to preventing violence against women. You know, for a second, can we imagine a state where women knew that their basics will always be met, that they would always have a stable income that would mean they could afford the basic costs of living for themselves and their children, and that they would be guaranteed of always having a roof over their head? How transformational would that be? Focusing the women's strategy around economic security really does take us one step towards that type of vision. Obviously, the women's strategy is about all women, so it really does focus on not just women that are using our services, but also women who are working in our sector. It's, stating the bleeding obvious to the people online today that ours is a feminised workforce. It is characterised by women doing really important, highly skilled, essential work, and often in with working conditions that include low pay and insecure working conditions. And we are really keen to continue to work with the Queensland Government to improve these working conditions for women working in the community services sector. I'm really absolutely looking forward to talking to the Attorney this afternoon about the women's strategy and about how we can all work together to make sure that the basic human right of equality is able to be realised for all women. Before we jump into it, I'm just going to mention a few housekeeping items. We are broadcasting live in Zoom webinar mode. We have received a number of pre-submitted questions from you, and we're going to use those as the basis for our conversation today with the attorney. But if you do have any burning questions that you want to ask, we have enabled the Q&A function, and so please do ask those questions. I can't absolutely promise that we'll get to them, but we will do our best. Also, just to be clear, this session is being recorded, so if that's not for you, you might want to jump off now. So, with all that said, we might jump into our conversation with the attorney. Welcome, attorney. Thank you for joining us.
My pleasure.
I think, it's really important to think about the context that this strategy exists within. And I know that in this strategy you talk about this strategy coming at a time of reckoning for women. What do you think that reckoning looks like in Queensland, and what exactly do you think Queensland's women are calling out for?
Yeah, well, thank you, Amy. I'm delighted to be here. And I think in the last 18 months where we've seen, women across the country take to the streets and say enough is enough. Enough is enough on men's violence against women, sexual harassment, but also this real desire to have a conversation about gender inequality and how women experience that. And, I have described that as a bit of a reckoning, and I think we have this huge momentum, and I was very keen in the women's strategy to really tap into that and make sure that we had a really strong statement of what government can do with the community and industry to work together to reach gender equality in Queensland. And I'm pretty proud of some of Queensland's achievements. Who would have thought that Queensland would be the first government in this country to have a cabinet of 50% women? So in terms of our leadership positions, I think we've done incredibly well. But there's certainly more to do, and certainly at a national level in terms of gender equality. The World Economic Forum Global Gender Index, we've fallen from 15th place in the world to 50th. I don't think at that national level there has been, this listening and hearing and believing women and really focusing government levers around reaching gender equality. So I wanted Queensland to be very clear, to listen to women. I think we had 1,600 people return surveys that they'd filled out, 99 written submissions, people sent postcards, we had roundtables. We really wanted to hear Queensland women and girls and then present a really strong strategy for government, community and industry to work together on. So I think it's great timing.
Yeah. So the strategy has 5 pillars. The overarching economic security priority, then safety and wellbeing, I think it is First Nations women, diverse women with diverse experience, and one about women's leadership. Yes. How did you why did you decide to sort of structure it with those 5 priorities, and why those particular priorities?
So I was really clear, I think coming out of COVID, where we had seen the gender pay gap widen, more women losing their jobs than men because of the industries they work in, because of insecure work, a widening superannuation gap, women being the fastest group of people in this country who are homeless. I really wanted to focus on women's economic participation and security. And that came through very strongly in the feedback. So the feedback that we had from women and girls was around women's economic participation, but also around tackling men's violence against women. So those were the 2 really key themes. And then, of course, we wanted to focus on our First Nations women, women who face additional barriers, as you've said, and then continue to focus on women's leadership. So it was really a combination of where we are in time coming out of a global pandemic with, big agencies focused on, recovering from COVID and economic recovery, how we could place women front and centre, but then also hearing from women about what they wanted to see in a strategy.
So if we could unpack that sort of overarching theme of an economic security a bit more, in plain language, I guess economic security means having stable income that would be sufficient to afford the basic things that you need to live for you and your children, and also to have a roof over your head. And the strategy says that economic security is the cornerstone of achieving gender equality, because of lack of economic security amplifies every other barrier that prevent women from achieving equality. Our living affordability report, our 2021 living affordability report, found that a single parent family, of which, as you'd be aware, 80% of those families are headed by a woman, are short an average of $58 a week. And for older women, they're short $43 a week. We also know that about 1 in 5 of Queensland's women are reliant on income support. So I guess the first question would be, do you support raising the rate of job seeker?
So as you've said, economic security is front and centre in the strategy, and there is a specific commitment to advocate, particularly the federal government, on helping helping ease cost of living pressures for women. So that's the job seeker rate, and we'll continue to advocate for that to be a livable wage for people, and as you say, predominantly women. But it's also things like childcare. Childcare came through so strongly in the consultation as the number one barrier for why women either weren't going back into the workforce, weren't increasing their hours, but also just as a cost of living pressure for families. Then, you've got all the work that's being done by federal Labor around secure jobs. So we know that we have a really polarised workforce in Australia, as you said. A lot of industries where we find predominantly women who are doing incredible work. Aged care is one of those industries, childcare. If we can actually better recognise the skills needed in those industries, we're going to close the gender pay gap, which will then in turn help us reach gender equality. So I think the job seeker is one way to help ease cost of living pressures. But I just think also, childcare, the superannuation gap keeps getting bigger. That's another federal government responsibility. We're really committed to continue to put the pressure on. But at a state level, obviously, we also wanted to focus on what we could do.
And so I guess at that state level, and maybe moving from what's in the strategy to what would be some practical things that could be done, what if we're talking about economic security for people on low incomes, what can the Queensland government do to provide better support, say, to single mums on low incomes?
Well, I think housing is a big one. And we've talked about how access to public housing, affordable housing, we know that women are, again, overrepresented in accessing, public housing, and also, women make up the most part of people accessing specialist homelessness services in Queensland. So I think, we've got a $2.9 billion strategy around housing. There's some specific policies there that I'm working with Minister Enoch on around DV and housing. So, I think housing is a huge one that the state government can do, but it's also things like working with QSuper and others to look at what we can do with the public service. We employ a lot of women, so what can we do to work with industry to really, lead best practice around how we can support women financially, getting better financial advice for women early on in their career, about superannuation. So obviously there's a lot of services that we provide that support women, but it's also things about working with industry to see how they can assist women as well.
Yeah, I think our members online would be really pleased to hear you talk about housing. We had one of our members from Cairns sent us a question prior to the events, sort of highlighting the amazing work that they're doing in Far North Queensland, really helping women and their children to move away from really dangerous situations and into stable and safe accommodation where they're able to rebuild their lives. This member's saying we need capacity to do more. Organisations know that they can do this, but they're so restricted by resourcing and the lack of stock.
Yes.
So, in highlighting housing, is that sort of saying that there'll be more to the work that the Queensland government's doing around housing for people on the lowest incomes.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think particularly for women and children experiencing domestic and family violence. So as I said, Minister Enoch and I have brought together an industry roundtable. You know, whilst I have policy responsibility for, you know, emergency shelters, we know that we need women to have transitional housing available. So it is a real key focus for me. And as you say, you can't really think about getting back into the workforce if you've got nowhere to live. So, you know, I think housing is a really important part of the equation about women's economic participation. So, you know, I know that Minister Enoch is also really passionate about this, and, you know, we're very keen to look at what more we can do. You know, we have continued to invest in shelters. I think when I was first the Minister for Prevention of Violence, there hadn't been any government shelters built for 20 years. I think we've built 7, but we've got to keep up with demand, and then it is about helping women transition into affordable housing. Yeah.
So that's, I guess, a good, you know, that's interesting to say that there's been increased investment into shelters. The second priority of the women's strategy is around safety and well-being. And we've had a question from one of our members asking about the funding of services to support women who have experienced domestic or family violence, as well as prevention. And this member is saying that the way that funding is structured, you know, often crisis-driven, often short-term, means it's very difficult to really make inroads. And also they're saying that sometimes the way that funding is put together means that there are women who aren't eligible and who fall through the cracks. So could you talk a little bit about how you'd like to see reform in the funding and commissioning of services space happening?
Yeah, it's a really big question, so I'll work my way through it. But, I mean, having volunteered on, you know, sexual assault service and the Logan Women's Health and Wellbeing Centre, which is now, you know, Centre for Women, you know, I know firsthand that short-term contracts make it really difficult for services, really difficult to retain good, skilled staff, but just really hard to do any sort of forward planning to meet demand. So, you know, we did introduce 5-year funding contracts. We continue to, you know, really keep the department to track about continuing to roll out longer-term funding contracts. I think that's a really big deal. I think the other thing that we're doing right now with Queensland Treasury Corp is reviewing the core funding for domestic and family violence services. So population growth, huge demand. So with this reckoning and women taking to the streets, more and more women are coming forward than ever before. So our services are under huge pressure. And we need to make sure we've actually got a core funding level that's sustainable into the future. So we are doing that work in partnership with the sector, with Queensland Treasury Corp, really basing it on data, because we don't want to keep, you know, just topping up small bits of money for, you know, 2 years at a time. Let's actually get it right. So that is going to take a bit of time. And in the meantime, obviously, we're working under the national partnership, particularly with that COVID money, to just make sure that services can meet the demand. And I know how hard they're working. So your members that are listening, we know how hard it is to meet that demand. So there's a little bit going on in the funding space, and obviously we've implemented all of the Not Now, Not Ever recommendations, which was an amazing start. I think there's been, you know, 600 million invested since then. But we've now had the Women's Safety and Justice Task Force that is also now looking at, you know, the legal system and making that far more trauma-informed. And they've also made some really key recommendations around prevention. So a primary prevention plan for Queensland. Now, we do quite a bit in this space, and the Respectful Relationships curriculum that we developed with Our Watch is fantastic, but we need to scale it up. It needs to be in every school, so every child in Queensland is getting access to that really good curriculum. And we also need to invest more in perpetrator programs and see that as part of prevention. And whilst there's been a huge increase in funding for perpetrator programs, your members will know that finding, you know, qualified staff, it's really difficult, really challenging work. And, you know, we've got the work going on, but that's also a challenge that we're going to, you know, work with the sector on. So there's a lot more we need to do in prevention. I completely agree. We also need the federal government. Prevention really is their key responsibility, but we need to do more at a state level too. So, I think we've got to do more in prevention. It can't just be all crisis driven, but we've got to make sure our crisis services have the funding they need while there's this huge demand going on, and we need to try and give them sustainable funding. So I hope there's a lot happening, but it needs to happen.
And I'm sure that answer has piqued a lot of interest for our members. And so if you do have questions, please do keep sending them in case we do have some time for your questions today. One of the things that we at QCOSS, informed by things our members had told us, one of the things that we've been advocating for a while now is for the Queensland Government to adopt gender responsive budgeting, which put simply, I guess, is just, I'm not sure that it is simple, but is a process of applying a gender lens over government policy and spend to make sure that the government's really aware of anything that they're doing that is going to further exacerbate gender inequality or have a larger benefit for men as opposed to women. And if they do decide to go down that track still, so great example is housing. A decision to invest in building more social housing is something that would be welcomed, but also an unintended consequence of that is really, or a consequence of that is really stimulating a part of the economy that's dominated by men. And so when government makes that decision, so a gender responsive government, a gender responsive budgeting process would really highlight that and then come up with some sort of solutions and strategies to mitigate that. Could be through procurement processes to make sure that those businesses that you're engaging to do the building have really positive employment conditions to make sure that they're employing women. We know that through the development of the women's strategy, quite a few other stakeholders also talked about gender responsive budgeting, and we're really excited to see that the women's strategy does include a commitment to enhancing gender aware budgeting in Queensland. So we know Victorian government have recently embedded this process within their treasury. There's a range of ways to do it. Can you talk a little bit about how the Queensland government might approach that?
Yeah, so those conversations are happening right now. So it was great to see that commitment in the women's strategy, and thank you to QCOSS. I think your advocacy really helped us get that firm commitment in the women's strategy. So obviously the Office for Women and Violence Prevention is sitting down with Treasury and Department of Premier and Cabinet at the moment to work through how each agency is going to put that into action. And under the women's strategy as well, every year there will be a women's statement that's released. Yep. So that will include the gender report card, gender equality report cards, but also more information about how that gender aware budgeting process is happening. And of course there will be the women's budget statement as well. And as you mentioned, the other thing that I'm really excited about is the commitments in the strategy around procurement. So you mentioned before how, government spends so much money, goods and services. How do we make sure that we are supporting businesses who support women? So we've done quite a lot in the procurement space as a government. I was really happy to see social enterprise as part of the procurement strategy, and now we really want to have a very good lens on how we can use our dollars, taxpayers' dollars, to make sure we're supporting those companies that have really great policies, have commitments to gender equality. They may have targets. So I think that's a really great piece of work, and Minister de Brenny, who's responsible for procurement, is really passionate about this as well, and he's got a great, really progressive procurement team to look at these issues. So the short answer is that work's ongoing about how that will actually work, but there's some really firm commitments in there. So,
and what do you think we'll see in particular in connection with this budget? Because I understand it's sort of a process of design still, but will we see something different in connection with this year's budget?
I think you'll see a much more comprehensive women's budget statement. So when I was first Minister for Women, there hadn't been a women's budget statement for a long time. And I think Treasury weren't exactly sure, perhaps, and so it ended up sort of just being bits taken from everyone's media release and put in one big media release. So I think, and Treasury officials, to their credit, and the Treasurer, really want to do a much better job of having, this sort of gender analysis really of the budget and have that front and centre in the women's budget statement. So it has gotten better every year.
Yeah.
I think it's much more detailed. Agencies are much more aware of really thinking about how their programs, impact women. So I think you'll continue to see a much more comprehensive women's budget statement.
Yeah, and I think we would love to see that intersectional lens applied as well. I guess, an observation would be that we can celebrate so much success for women, but when we pull the data apart and look at outcomes for First Nations women, outcomes for women with a disability, we start to see a pretty different picture. So
yes,
if we can apply that, that would be wonderful,
I
Attorney.
will do my best.
And I guess, it is clear, that there is a real focus in the women's strategy on First Nations women, and one of the key commitments being to address the high rates of incarceration and over-representation of First Nations women in the criminal justice system. You've already referenced the Women's Safety and Justice Task Force, chaired by the Honourable Justice McMurdo, and the work that they're doing. The second discussion paper did acknowledge that the Aboriginal Torres Strait Islander experience of the criminal justice system has to be placed within history and, I quote, "and continuing environment of colonisation, displacement, racism, punishment, regulation and control." With that in mind, how will the women's strategy in connection with the outcomes of the task force really practically start to make inroads into this issue, and how will we be able to measure outcomes so that we can be sure that we really are achieving a change in this area?
Yeah, and look, I think we have to acknowledge at the outset that First Nations women have experienced violence, since colonisation, and that continuing trauma continues to impact them in their communities. And I was so pleased that the first recommendation from the Women's Safety and Justice Task Force was any reform in tackling men's violence against women, particularly First Nations women, has to be done in the context of overrepresentation. So you have to look at overrepresentation if you're going to make inroads into tackling violence against First Nations women, because they are, unfortunately, tragically overrepresented in the justice system and also domestic and family violence data. So, I think the women's strategy really places First Nations women, front and centre, and, I think the work that will happen in the women's strategy will intersect really well with the work that Attorney General and Justice are doing to look at overrepresentation. And there's some commitments in there, obviously, about working with First Nations women. It references June Oscar's report, Wiani Utangani, an amazing report, which very clearly says First Nations women in local communities often know what needs to happen to support families, and they need to be given the resources and the space to be able to come up with those programs. We really do need a place-based approach driven by First Nations women, and I'm really keen to see that come out of the women's strategy and the work that we're doing in response to the Women's Safety and Justice Task Force. So it is all connected, and I'm really excited about tackling some of these really key issues in the justice system, because I think there's a lot more we can do. As a state government, we have commitments around closing the gap, but Queensland really does need a strong strategy to tackle overrepresentation. We don't have a justice partnership. I think there's a lot we can do in that space, and I want First Nations women to be front and centre.
And do you, in order to sort of measure those outcomes, and I guess this applies to the strategy overall, will there be an evaluation framework that sits alongside it and public annual reporting on outcomes?
Yes, there will be. So in terms of the women's strategy, obviously there'll be the annual women's statement, and then in terms of the Women's Safety and Justice Task Force, they very helpfully have given us very clear recommendations about implementation and having someone oversight implementation, reporting to Parliament, making reports publicly available. But, in terms of overrepresentation, looking at the data, we will be able to measure whether or not we have seen a decrease. And, we are looking very specifically at the kinds of offences, where there is, strong overrepresentation of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, and looking at what we can do. So, using data, but also then, implementing the recommendations and using the oversight mechanisms that have been recommended.
So the fourth pillar, I think, of the strategy, I could have that wrong, but I think it's the fourth pillar, is diverse women and diverse experiences. And one of our members online has just asked a great question about the disproportionate experience of women with a disability of discrimination, employment or gender-based violence, and would like to know what strategies, what's included in the women's strategy to address that issue?
Yeah, so as you say, it is the fourth pillar. I guess it's about recognising that, many women in our community face additional barriers, and how do we elevate their voices so that we're not just addressing the gender discrimination that they may face. How do we actually embed their voices into what we're doing across government? So there is a real focus on women with a disability, women from culturally and linguistically diverse backgrounds. So, I guess it's about elevating their voices, making sure that we're working with them when we develop, our women's annual statements, really taking that lens to the work we're doing in Treasury around women's budget statements. So, I think it's really great that the strategy has highlighted and recognised that, not every woman's experience is the same, and there are women in our community who are vulnerable, and we do know that women with a disability do experience higher rates of violence, and a lot of the time it's not reported. How are we actually collecting data from our agencies, frontline agencies, courts, police, to make sure that we're capturing that data? We had a really good Justice Roundtable with Minister Ryan and Minister Lennard the other day with disability stakeholders. So there is some really good work happening. There's a lot more to do, particularly in the justice system, but even just capturing the data and different agencies capturing the same data is a real challenge, and sharing that information as well. So we know that I know all your members will know that agencies sharing information and data is a real problem to getting, whole of government solutions. But there is some really good work happening in that space.
Yeah, we in our in the consultation part of developing the women's strategy, we had a really wonderful opportunity to work closely with the Office for Women, and such an impressive bunch of people working in there, so passionate and aware of the issues. How does it work in practical terms, sort of getting that perspective and those commitments up out of the Office for Women and right across departments? And so when I'm thinking about women with a disability and their and outcomes for those women, there's a number of other departments who play a major role in addressing that. So how does that work in practice?
Well, I think the good thing about the women's strategy is obviously it comes to Cabinet, so every agency has to sign up to the commitments, and then obviously each annual statement will go to Cabinet. So each agency obviously then has a commitment to follow through on what as a government we've committed to, and again, central agencies, Department of Premier and Cabinet and Treasury will play a really key role in making sure that each department are providing information on how they are meeting those commitments and how they're implementing those commitments. So I have found, in my time in government, and it took me a little while as someone who hadn't worked for government before, anytime there's a Cabinet process, there is real discipline in government agencies about, making sure that they are implementing Cabinet decisions. Like the whole bureaucracy is set up to really respond to cabinet decisions, and there's a lot of timelines that have to be met. So I think having those annual reporting statements means that departments actually do have to feed in and make sure that they're implementing the commitments in the women's strategy, because it's part of a cabinet process. So that's a very internal kind of way to describe what happens, but that's actually how you get departments to prioritise work.
Great. So we've got another question here from online, and I guess this relates both to the priority, well, it sort of relates to almost all of the priorities because it's about economic security as well as safety and wellbeing, and has particular relevance for women with diverse experiences. Our members asking, what are your thoughts about providing housing and mental health supports together?
I think it makes a lot of sense. You know, so obviously the more that we can meet the needs of women and them not have to go through separate doors and separate agencies to access the support they need, you know, the better the outcomes are going to be. One of the commitments in the women's strategy that I am really proud of is our commitment to a dedicated women's health strategy, which will of course include mental health. But essentially in Queensland we don't have a dedicated health strategy for women, and I just think that will be a game changer for women. So I do think there's an opportunity to bring in mental health supports into some of that work. But how positive that we will now have a women's health strategy. I think that's.
And are there other jurisdictions that have a women's health strategy?
Victoria, definitely. I'm sure there may be some others, but you know, again, this has been a real push from the sector, and you know, a credit to them for advocating for a dedicated women's health strategy. So you know, and again, having worked on the board of a women's health centre, I do think there needs to be specific policy for women accessing health services. And again, you know, a strategy can just be something that sits on a piece of paper, but when you actually get government to, you know, run a lens over everything that's happening in the health space and women's health and bring it together and have commitments for agencies to work together and implement change, that is how you see change. And I was thinking about the first women's strategy that we had, and like how much reform we actually got out of that strategy. So women on boards, when we came into government, we were sitting at 31% women on government boards and bodies. We're now at 53%. You know, we decriminalised abortion. We legislated against revenge porn. We outlawed offensive slogans on wicked campers. Like, you know, we actually achieved so much. And it was because we brought government agencies together and said, right, transport and main roads, you need to go tackle those offensive, you know, trailers, and, you know, really did get agencies working together. So that's the power of a strategy. It's not just something that is a statement of government's intent. It creates work for departments to report against.
And so for a women's health strategy, because it's so health specific, what would be, like, how does that actually get developed in practice, and do you know what the key timeline, like the
My timeline will be a lot quicker than what I'm sure Queensland Health want to do, but that will be interesting. But essentially it will be the Office for Women, so my agency, sitting down, and Yvette Darth has been great and is really wanting to work on this with Queensland Health, and really sitting down and going, right, like what, and you know, working with stakeholders about what is it that women need access to, where are the gaps right now for women, and what more can we be doing to, you know, promote women's health and wellbeing.
And then does that sort of sit under the overarching women's strategy?
So again, it'll still be something that goes to Cabinet. There'll be a framework for implementation, but yeah, it's a commitment that's come out of the women's strategy.
So I think this question kind of goes back to what we were talking about at the beginning around economic security for women on really low incomes, and the question relates to the rapid take-up of payday loans and services like Afterpay, particularly for victim survivors of domestic violence. How does the women's strategy sort of look at help to consider women in that type of situation was, what is the Queensland Government doing to overcome this sort of growing issue?
Yeah, it's a huge issue. And when I was Minister for Communities, obviously we did a whole lot of work around payday lending and introducing good money stores and increasing, financial counselling right across the board. And I think with the introduction of coercive control as a criminal offence, there's going to be even more of a light shone on, financial control. And as part of that, we are going to need to increase access for women to financial support and services. But it's also about partnering again with industry to see what more they can do. I think the Chartered Accountants of Australia obviously have some really good policies on this, but how can we work with financial counsellors, corporates to actually, make sure that they're providing at no cost or low cost support for women around their finances. And there's some really great examples of corporates, doing really good work. We have a DV Corporate Roundtable, which brings together corporate leaders to see what more they could be doing. I know Telstra have done amazing work. They've got a whole call centre set up for anyone that rings through who may be a victim of violence. They waive the requirements for women to produce ID documents if they've fled. I know CommBank has some really great policies in place, particularly where you've got joint mortgages and it's domestic violence situations. So I think there's a real opportunity for some of our corporates to step up and work with us to provide more information to women for financial support, and then obviously for government to look at more resources for financial counselling, because it's going to continue to be an area that I think gets more attention, particularly as the community begins to understand more about coercive control and sort of physical violence. I think it's a really great question, and there's a lot more we can do there.
Yeah, I think the tension is always about financial counselling, how much financial counselling can actually improve the lives of people on the lowest incomes, because in our experience, most women on extremely low incomes are really often very, very good at budgeting and managing their own money, but the reality is that the income that they receive is just not enough. And so I think things like the funding for the Neils program that the Queensland Government recently announced in connection with the last budget and has been implementing is the sort of thing that we need to see actually additional money for people.
So that they become attractive options as opposed to the cash converters of the world where there's a whole lot of,
We have a question here that goes to employment. So you mentioned before about the Queensland Government, I guess, being one of the biggest employers of women in the state, and looking at how conditions can be improved to make sure that they are a gold star employer of women. Can you talk a little bit more about how our sector and also businesses can learn from what the Queensland Government's doing within the public sector? And I think it would be fascinating also to hear, given that the Queensland Government really sets the conditions for the employment of workers in our sector, what the government might be planning in terms of making sure that some of those high standards for the public sector are also the same for women working in the community sector.
Yeah, another really interesting question, and I was really proud that Queensland was the first state to announce paid domestic and family violence leave, something that we still have not seen, fortunately, from the federal government. So that I think was a huge way to demonstrate our commitment in this space. We've recently, not recently, I think she's been there for over 6 months now, Dr. Linda Collier started as an Equity Diversity Commissioner within the public service to hold agencies to account about making sure that they have really great policies and procedures in place to support women. There's a whole lot of work that we're doing around sexual harassment. So obviously commitments coming out of the Jenkins report, but setting up a sexual harassment referral office, a sexual harassment code of conduct. The Anti-Discrimination Commission is currently looking at a positive duty on all employers, so not just the public service, to prevent sexual harassment, which, I'm very excited about, and something that, I've been looking at for some time. So we are doing a lot within the public sector here in Queensland, and I think it's important that we do lead the way if we're going to ask industry and community to come with us. But I still think, we're not perfect. Interestingly, just in his recent interim report, Professor Coldrake noted that we still, in those senior DG, DDG, sort of executive director roles, still don't have enough women and enough diversity. So, the question before about people with a disability, we don't have enough public servants even working on policy for people with a disability who have lived experience, people from culturally and linguistically diverse backgrounds, and First Nations Queenslanders. So we've still got a lot to do in that space, but there is some good work happening.
Yeah. And I guess that piece of work that's just commenced, which, through Department of Communities, which is about developing a procurement process specific to community organisations, would hopefully be a mechanism within which some of the stuff out of the women's strategy could actually be reflected into the way government procures community services, and hopefully could overcome some of those long-standing issues around, the length of contracts, that creating insecure work.
Yes, absolutely. So so there's some really good work. There's now a community services procurement panel that's been set up, some really good consultation there. So that's exciting as well.
Yeah. So a question here about respectful relationships work being done in schools, wanting to understand what the Queensland Government is doing to make sure, I guess, that those, to encourage those programs, not just in schools, but also in workplaces and in other social venues, places around the community. Can you comment on that?
Wouldn't that be great? I think we did develop a few years ago an online training package which organisations can have access to. It's online training about how to recognise, respond and refer when domestic violence presents in workplaces. So that was really excellent work, and again, with our corporate partners, we try and make sure that they run that training. Obviously, White Ribbon still does workplace accreditation. But I think there is still so much more workplaces can do. So we're now talking about preventing sexual harassment. I still think there's a lot more workplaces can do to, not just support victims of violence, but also, working with perpetrators. So some of the big corporates are doing really interesting work in this space, and we don't leave our private lives at home when we come to the workplace. So we do need employers to really be a part of the conversation, and that's part of what our corporate roundtable does. So we've got big corporates, but also like Clubs Queensland, people that do employ a lot of Queenslanders, and really just talking about best practice. It's going to be different for what happens at Telstra to what happens in the small business sort of, in my community even. But I think if government can work with big corporates to provide really good templates and really good examples of how, we can tackle sexual harassment and violence when it presents in the workplace, then I think we should absolutely, be encouraging industry to put in place those really good examples for others to follow, and government can help with that.
And back to the question about funding for community organisations, I think we talked a lot, you talked a lot about sort of funding for both crisis and prevention. One thing I don't think we really touched on was funding for perpetrator programs and behaviour change programs. Is there sort of plans in that space, and can you comment on what's working and what we could scale? Really
good question. So and I talk a bit about this. So since 2015, we've actually increased funding for perpetrator programs by 140%. And that's like huge, but we were coming off a very low base, let's be honest. So as the research and evaluation comes out about what is effective in these programs, we need to be able to scale up our response. So the task force has recommended that there does need to be many more perpetrator programs available. There are long wait lists, so we do need to do that work in terms of building capability around staff. You know, we now have national standards for how perpetrator programs can be run, but we also need to trial different things. There's also recommendations about specific programs, you know, for First Nations men and how we, you know, design that. And again, that needs to be locally led by First Nations people. And there's also really good recommendations around working with young men. So Renew is a great program. It's working with young men who are around sort of 11 to 14 who have just started exhibiting violent behaviour towards their mothers. So before they even get to an intimate relationship, how do we intervene and understand why, you know, this, you know, controlling behaviour, violent behaviour is happening? So that's been evaluated by Griffith University, so we're waiting for that to be finalised. We want to expand that kind of program.
Fantastic.
So there is, again, a lot happening. There does need to be further evaluation about what works, but we also need to, you know, try new things and evaluate them. But essentially, I think in the next few years you will see a huge scale up of investment in men's behavioural change programs, and we do need to see that as part of prevention.
That's right, yeah, great. So the strategy makes a commitment to re-establishing a high-level panel to ensure that people from the LGBTIQ plus community have their voices heard and are able to influence government strategy and decision-making. Can you comment a little bit about how that's going to work?
A little bit. So that work is obviously underway. So the Office for Women will obviously do some further consultation with the LGBTI plus community on how they want to set that up. So obviously it's a re-establishment. So what worked well last time, perhaps what we could do better. So that work's underway right now. But again, I think that's a really great commitment to elevate the voices of that community.
So we've got another question here. Thank you, Attorney, for being so willing to answer our live questions. There's a question here about the current Queensland Skilling Queenslanders for Work program. And our members saying, you know, that these programs are currently funded for 12 months, which obviously, as you've already touched on, is problematic for our workforce because it doesn't allow us to employ our staff, which is predominantly female, in permanent roles where they can have that feeling of economic security and assurance of economic security. Is there any consideration being given to look at how that funding is structured?
So very good question, when I was the training minister, we did explore this. I do think there are opportunities for there to just be ongoing contracts. I think the issue has been Skilling Queenslanders for Work has been a program that gets funded every few years, but I think now as a government we've said this program is so successful. You know, we brought it back when we were elected in 2015. We just need this to be a permanent program. So, you know, once the funding is there in the forward estimates, it's not something that gets renewed every few years.
Right.
Then there's an opportunity for those longer, you know, term contracts. So that's just an internal funding issue that we, you know, are in the process of sorting so that, you know, it's not something that, you know, as the minister, every budget you go back and say we need to continue to fund this program. So I think you're absolutely right, and it is a great program that helps so many women get the skills they need to get back into the workforce.
Thank you so much for answering all of those questions and being willing to take live questions.
My pleasure.
You know, obviously being such a genuinely passionate minister committed to gender equality and always with an eye to women who are experiencing the most levels of discrimination in our community. I think the Women's Strategy is a testament to that commitment. it really does put eyes on women on low incomes and women with diverse experiences. So thank you so much for today, and also thank you for your leadership. Really appreciate it, and really look forward to continuing to work with you and the government on the implementation of the strategy. So obviously QCOSS every year does make a budget submission. This year our budget submission does have a lot of touch points with the women's strategy and gender equality. Our priorities are around funding for community organisations, increased funding for community and neighbourhood centres, more funding for social housing, gender responsive budgeting, and ensuring that people on the lowest incomes have a clear benefit out of the Queensland Government's energy plan. So please do follow with us to see how much of that is implemented. We can see some great sort of signs that you and our sector are being heard through advocacy in the women's strategy. We do have our budget breakfast, promotion of our budget breakfast went live today. So we have secured the treasurer for an In Conversation style event on the 23rd of June. And obviously we'll be talking about touching on many of the things that we talked to the attorney today, but really drilling down on what the government's spending does in terms of working towards that joint vision of equality, opportunity and wellbeing for all Queenslanders. Also just wanted to let you know that we do have our next In Conversation scheduled with Dr. Chris Sara, the Director General of Department of Disabilities, Seniors and Aboriginal Torres Strait Islander Partnerships. It's scheduled during Reconciliation Reconciliation Action Week on the 3rd of June, and you can register on our website. Thank you all so much for participating so actively in this afternoon's event. Thank you again to the attorney and the QUT Centre for Justice, and I hope you all have a wonderful afternoon.